Everyone to this evening's webinar with Adrian Reed. My name's Moira. Some of you have met me before. I'm the brand manager for Faculty Training Institute. Essentially, as always with these sorts of events, we are very, very excited about this evening's topic, which is business analyst or business strategist. I think Adrian in some ways needs no introduction in South Africa. But really, this is part of a series and discussions that we've been in for a couple of months. We really want to give you as our delegates an opportunity to really learn from one of the finest in the field. And so tonight's webinar is one of these occasions. And then you're going to see Adrian will take you through some of the live workshops that we're going to be doing in South Africa around about the time of the IBA Summit. But essentially, we're trying to add to our portfolio of short courses for especially practicing BAs and just for those of you that are wanting to learn very specific sort of niche areas of business analysis. So we're really hoping that this is going to add a lot of value going forward. And as I say, Adrian, in many ways, needs no introduction, but he's a principal consultant and director at Black Metric Business Solutions. He's a past president of the IBA, the UK chapter. He speaks internationally. He's spoken in South Africa before, and he's also an author and has currently just published his second book, which will be available in South Africa soon, and of course when he's out here for the summit as well. So really, Adrian, welcome and thank you very much, and welcome to all our delegates, and I really hope you enjoy this webinar.
Fantastic. Thank you very much for such a warm welcome, Moira, and thanks to everyone for tuning in. So the topic I'm going to discuss tonight, it's a topic that's really, really close to my heart as a BA practitioner. And that is, I'm going to talk about strategic business analysis, because probably all of us around the virtual table here would agree that there is huge value in early upfront business analysis. There's huge value in getting us as BAs engaged as soon as there's an idea. Yet we've probably all been in situations where stakeholders have made a decision and they just want to get going. And there's the just do it, the JDI approach. And we're sort of almost pressured into just writing requirements. And that's not to say writing requirements isn't important, it absolutely is, but we've probably all experienced times when it's really hard because the scope is like jelly. It's like trying to pin jelly to a wall. But what I'm going to really talk about today is the fact that I think inherent to what we do as business analysts is an element of business strategy. Maybe not for the whole organization, but we are guardians of the strategy for the project or the initiative that we are working within. Now, just to tie this to the two upcoming courses, and I will mention these at the end of the session as well, but the two courses that I've got coming up that Moira mentioned, one is around enterprise strategy analysis, one is pre-project problem analysis. But what I wanted to just mention before I kick off is this webinar is giving you a sneak peek of some of the content. So if you are planning to come along, if you enjoy what you see on this webinar, that these courses will be really useful for you. But even if you can't make it this time, we'll cover enough of the, a few techniques that you'll be able to go away and use them after the webinar. I'm planning to speak for about 30 or 40 minutes and allow lots of time for questions at the end. So do keep the questions coming, just type them in the Q&A box, plenty of time for questions at the end. So my presentation has two main parts built around three of those good BA questions that we all ask a lot. I want to start with why. And I want to start by really talking about why as BAs we ought to continue to be interested in strategy. I'm going to use a bit of a curveball example for that bit of the presentation, so strap yourselves in. It's a historic example. Then I'm going to move on pretty rapidly and talk about what and how, share with you some techniques, It'll be a whistle-stop tour, but if you want to know any more about any of the techniques, you can contact me afterwards. You may well have seen a few of them before, in which case it will be a bit of a refresher. So, starting with why. I want to actually transport you back in time. So imagine, if you will, that it's 1912 and it's April the 15th and it's 2:20 a.m. and we are looking out to the North Atlantic Ocean. We're about 400 miles south of Newfoundland, and there's an event that's about to unfold in front of our eyes that is of historic importance. I'm pretty sure that most or many of us dialed into this call are now sort of screaming at our muted headset saying it's the Titanic. The Titanic sank on that day, and you're absolutely right. Now, if I were to ask you what sunk the Titanic, you would almost certainly say an iceberg. And again, you'd be absolutely right. But what if I were to tell you that actually the root cause of the tragic events of that night on April the 15th, 1912, really wasn't just due to the iceberg? It could be argued that a series of strategically bad decisions were made when the Titanic was being built, which meant that essentially the strategy of the Titanic was tearing itself apart. So if you know the story of the Titanic, I mean, it's an interesting one. It sort of entered our collective consciousness through film and folklore, myth and mystery. But one thing that most people remember is the fact it was marketed as an unsinkable ship. Always a dangerous marketing campaign, an unsinkable ship. And one of its primary flood defences was the hull was divided into 16 watertight compartments. The trouble was, there were some design compromises that were made as the design of the Titanic emerged and elaborated. So whilst there was the focus on safety on one end, on the other end, there was a need for luxury. There were going to be millionaires on board the Titanic. They were going to expect opulence. And one of the things that the White Star Line, who commissioned the Titanic, insisted upon was a long, lavish ballroom on one of the upper decks. Trouble was, this long, lavish ballroom spanned a number of these watertight compartments. What this meant was, if water ever rose to that deck, it could spill between the different compartments. One of the key flood defences had been nibbled away, but it was kind of missed. The strategy was sort of pulled apart. Also, because it was marketed as an unsinkable ship, there's an element of complacency that set in, to the point where they actually cancelled the lifeboat drills in Southampton before the boat set off, because they were so confident that they'd never need to evacuate. There's also some evidence that there was pressure on cost. Recent chemical analysis of the rivets. Now, the rivets for the Titanic would have been handmade by skilled craftspeople. They were made of iron, and recent chemical analysis has shown that it was made with poor quality constituent material. Now, the thing about poor quality iron, I'm told, is that if you hit it, it shatters. So you've now got the situation where the Titanic's primary flood defences have been nibbled away, and parts of the ship are held together with rivets that will shatter if you hit them. It's also been suggested there was a pressure for on-time arrival. About the time the Titanic hit the iceberg, it was reportedly travelling about 22 knots. That would have been considered far too fast for treacherous waters back in April 15. Why it was going that fast, nobody can know for sure. There's been a suggestion, though, because it was the maiden voyage, the captain was under pressure to get to its destination on time or early, because the press would be waiting. What I find most phenomenal is that there were actually warnings that were ignored, specific warnings about icebergs. Turns out the Titanic had one of the most sophisticated radio telegraphy systems on board of its era. It could hear messages from nearby ships. It could relay them. It could even reach land relay points. Trouble was, the radio was operated not by the White Star Line that ran the Titanic, but by Marconi. And one of the ways that Marconi made its money was by sending private telegrams. It turns out in 1912, if you were a millionaire on board the Titanic, one of the hobbies you'd have is sending nice little telegrams back home saying about how wonderful it was on board the ship. And this created a strategic challenge for the operators because they were torn, with operational traffic and commercial traffic. There were no fewer than 6 warning messages received in the lead up to the tragic events. The last was 10:30 p.m., just 4 hours before the Titanic hit the iceberg. It gave specific coordinates of the ice field. Apparently the Titanic responded with, "Stop it, shut up, you're jamming me," because they were desperately trying to get some commercial traffic through to the nearest land relay point. And you look at that story and it's a clash of different implied missions. You've got these strategic differences pulling the operation apart. And I know what you're thinking. You're thinking that's an interesting story, Adrian, but we don't work on ships. We don't work on the Titanic. I mean, I sense we've probably all worked on projects that feel a bit like the Titanic. But I bet you've worked on projects where there've been pressures to make design compromises, where there's been a pressure on cost, where it's like, do it cheaper, do it quicker. There's been a pressure to deliver on time or before, and you've been probably warning people, and those warnings haven't been heeded. So you get this kind of parallel on projects as well. The trouble is, if there's not that cohesive strategy within the organization and within the project, then every decision becomes so torturous. You get situations where at every possible branch, there has to be cognitive effort into working out whether we go left or right, because there's no vision, there's no unified problem that we're trying to solve. And that is where projects can start to pull themselves apart, and we risk hitting our own organizational icebergs. And it doesn't matter whether we're agile or waterfall, the same patterns can occur if we haven't got that unifying vision. We may need to adapt that vision from time to time, but having that unifying vision of where we're going is so crucially important. So I've talked a bit about why. I want to move on now and talk about what and how. I want to define or give a possible definition of strategy and give a very quick whistle-stop tour of a few techniques. So first of all, strategy. And there are probably as many definitions of strategy as there are BAs. The best, or the definition I've found most useful is from an excellent book. And I mean, like, if you like reading, look up this book. It's a book called Good Strategy, Bad Strategy by Rummelt. It was out in 2011. And Rummelt describes strategy as a cohesive response to an important challenge. He goes on to say that unlike a standalone decision or goal, a strategy is a coherent set of analyses, concepts, policies, arguments, and actions that respond to a high stakes challenge. Now, if you let that kind of mull around your head, let it sort of combine with all of your analytical thinking, and it's like, well, we could argue about whether the word challenge is right for us as analysts. But that whole idea of cohesiveness, of things needing to trace together, that sounds a lot like what we do. You look at the language used there, analysis, concepts, policies, these are things that are relevant for us in our everyday lives. So whether or not we've ever known it, whether or not we've ever said it, there is an element of our role that is business strategist as well as business analyst. So thinking about organizational strategy first, just a model to throw in case you're interested, is a model known as VMOST. And in fact, calling VMOST a model is too grandiose, really. It's really just an acronym, a mnemonic. It stands for Vision, Mission, Objective, Strategy, Tactics. Okay, so I'll show you this on the picture in a second. And if you imagine that organizations ought to have a guiding vision and mission. So a vision is perhaps a a future state that they're trying to get to. A mission is a core purpose. And those things ought to be clear, concise, repeatable, meaningful. It shouldn't just be template driven. It should be actually motivating, ideally. Often that vision and mission is supported by a set of objectives. So you measure whether you're pushing towards your mission with some precise, specific, measurable, achievable, realistic, time-bound organizational objectives. But those objectives are achieved through the medium and long-term strategies that typically are broad themes. But where the rubber meets the road is at the tactical level. And these are the actionable tasks and projects that actually help us bridge that strategic gap, which helps us push towards our objectives, towards our vision and mission. That probably sounds a bit abstract, so let me give you an example. So I was previously a volunteer for the IIBA UK chapter for many, many years. I think IIBA is an awesome organisation. IIBA's global mission is to unite a community of professionals to create better business outcomes. That tells you a lot about what the organisation does. It's not just about BAs, it's about anyone that does business analysis. It's inclusive. It's a good high-level mission. But then in the UK, for example, we had objectives. So we were aiming, when I was on the board a few years ago, we were aiming to hit 1,000 members. And we were going to run like 30 events across the UK. And we were going to run 12 virtual events and so on and so forth. But we were a volunteer team, so we had to have very clear strategies to achieve those things. So for example, we had a branch strategy, which meant that we could run events all across the UK. We had a strategy of collaborating with like-minded organisations so we could cross-pollinate the memberships. If you want an example of a vision, another organisation I have a huge amount of time for is the Alzheimer's Society, that has a vision of a world without dementia. Tells you a lot about what the organisation does, also what it doesn't do. So if you think about looking at this a different way, and if you imagine this was like a rocket ship that was launching our organisation up into some successful orbit, and my PowerPoint skills aren't up to much, so suspend disbelief and just pretend this next slide looks like a rocket, okay? Well, you'd have like the vision and mission in the nose cone. You've got the objectives providing it with fuel, the strategic themes are maybe the thrusters, and you've got the boosters at the tactics at the bottom. But our change portfolio sort of sits across, bridging that strategy and tactics, and it provides the fuel for the organisation to change. And ideally, every project we ever worked on would have a clear line of sight from the project through to the strategy, through to the objectives, through to the vision, and then all of our requirements or user stories or whatever could trace in there, and it would be wonderful, and it would be. But you and I know it doesn't always work like that. Because what happens often is we have organizations that are siloed. We have different teams, all with slightly different perspectives. And someone has the bright idea of having a cross-functional portfolio of change, or the leaky bucket of change, as I like to call it, because change goes in there and some of it leaks out, and hopefully some of it's delivered at some point. But it's not always as joined up and as traceable as we would like it to be. And how does stuff get into that portfolio of change? Well, sometimes people say things like, it's a great idea. You've always got to worry when someone comes to your desk on Monday morning and says, I've had an idea. You think, really? Let's do some analysis on that, make sure that what the impact is. Of course, there are many good ideas out there as well. Or why wouldn't we? Why wouldn't we buy X system? The no-brainer decision. I always think it must be called no-brainer because no brain was involved in the making the decision. Or we've chosen a vendor. Of course you have. And the boss says our client wants, and the trump card is, and we have a business case. And I'm not arguing against business cases. They are useful. If they're done well, they are excellent organizational assets. But, you know, speaking amongst friends on this webinar, we've all seen business cases that are complete works of fiction. They shouldn't be, but sometimes they are. They're created just to get the project working, and that creates dysfunction. We then end up with that perfect storm where the organization is doing projects that are pulling in different directions. And if we're not careful, the whole organization starts to pull itself apart. You get a strategic void. You get the organization leadership saying that we should be doing one thing, but actually doing something else. And that crack gets greater and greater, and it becomes problematic. And we become really, really vulnerable to those icebergs, those organizational icebergs. And these are exactly the sorts of things that good quality pre-project problem analysis and enterprise or strategy analysis can help avoid. And there's a whole bunch of stuff we can do as BAs. So if you take that vMost, and by the way, I wouldn't suggest that vMost should be used as like a template. It does need to be, thought through. It can be emergent to an extent as well. But if you think about that definition of strategy from Rummelt, a cohesive response to an important challenge, well, that implies that there's an organization or there's a current state or there's some place we are at the moment, and there's somewhere we want to be, and there's a way of getting there. We predict a trajectory, a general sense of direction, and we call that strategy. Okay. Well, great. Well, you kind of think about that metaphor and think about what we do as BAs. Well, we take a current state, albeit at perhaps a more detailed, important, granular, detailed level. And often there are problems with that current state. And in the UK, we always represent problems with thunderclouds, because thunder is really unpleasant when you have too much of it. We want to get to some future state, which is a sunny, nice place to be. And we talk about a change. Now, those of you that are familiar with the business analysis body of knowledge, IIBA's BA-BOK guide, you may have seen there's a strategy analysis knowledge area, and it talks about a change strategy. And what's really interesting is, although as BAs we might not be actually involved with the organizational strategy, we are certainly involved. We can be involved in helping co-create the change strategy for an initiative, an intervention, or a project. And in doing so, we can help avoid those organizational icebergs. So building on the BA-BOK framework, the strategy analysis framework in BA-BOK, it looks a bit like this. I've embellished it. I've used different words. So this isn't verbatim from BA-BOK. It's inspired by. But you can think there are techniques we can use to analyze the current state, internally and externally. What's the problem internally? What's our environment like externally? Where are the icebergs? We can define or predict the future state. Where do we want to get to? We can analyze the gap, analyze risks, and define some form of value in the form of a business case. So in the webinar today, what I'm going to do is talk about just a couple of quick techniques for analyzing the current state, a couple of techniques for defining or predicting the future state, and then I'll open for Q&A. So first of all, thinking about the external current state. A technique that many of us may have come across in one form or another is a technique known as steeple. There are various versions of this. You may hear another version that's called pestle or pestel. They're very similar. And steeple, again, it's really just a mnemonic. It stands for social, technological, economic, environmental, political, legal, and ethical. And it's really about doing an external environmental sweep and saying what stuff is relevant for our organization. If we're looking at an internal problem, we might think what external stuff might affect this problem or might be relevant for any solution or intervention we put in place to make things better. So taking an example, and I know I'm showing my age with this one, but in the UK, in the 80s, 90s and early 2000s, there was a high street chain called Blockbuster Video. And I can remember being really excited, going and getting renting a video, and then later you'd rent a DVD. And it died in the mid 2000s. And it probably died because of the likes of streaming media, Netflix, and also because the business model had changed, right? Everyone hated late fees because there were just other opportunities here. Now, what these categories do, you can brainstorm or carry out analysis on each of them to say, well, what social factors might affect our organization? People are starting to use online media, or, online video sharing. That's really important if you're Blockbuster in the early 2000s. The fact there are technological streaming that's getting better quality, that's really important if you're Blockbuster in the early 2000s. You don't want to be the person, you don't want to be the BA working at Blockbuster Video that's working on the project to make the experience of checking out a DVD 20% quicker. Like, you don't want to be working on that project when everyone is turning their nose up at DVDs. You would literally be, or metaphorically be, rearranging deck chairs on the Titanic. So steeple is an excellent technique to help us think about those external icebergs that might hit us. And it's worth keeping them. It's like a radar or sonar for our project. But of course, it's likely that the problem that we are looking to respond to is internal. And the humble old fishbone diagram is such a useful tool in this situation. We can use techniques like 5 whys to ladder up and ladder down various different elements of a problem. So often when stakeholders throw a solution at us, like, I want this new CRM package, well, you find out you don't necessarily need a new CRM package, or you might, but actually there are other problems there as well. Maybe it's lack of engagement, lack of customer retention, or whatever. And with a fishbone diagram, you draw the effect or problem on the head of the fish and you examine it from different dimensions. You can actually add any label you want. I always start with the 4 Ps typically. Policies, which is any high-level organizational policies that are affecting the problem situation. Procedures, so think about processes, and they can be completely manual. It might be that there's a really ineffective manual process. Sometimes people haven't been trained, or they're not motivated, or they've not been supported, and that can be a root cause as well. And the final P traditionally was plant, and if we're in a physical manufacturing environment, it still may be plant, but I tend to put technology in brackets, because if we're working in a knowledge worker environment, often that's the IT. And we work our way back, and you can add primary, secondary, tertiary causes. This is just a sample. They can become a lot more complicated than this. But you can see on the right-hand side, we have 60% of customers abandon their application online and ring the call center instead. So maybe this is some form of online ordering for a shop or whatever, or an insurance company or whatever. And we can see that actually there's a policy reason for that. There's no price differential. People have no incentive to actually order online. We've also got a complex application process, but that's because there are complex laws. We need a physical signature. There's also the way we're incentivizing people is that they want to close the deal offline. And of course, we've got some technological challenges as well, which are significant alongside all of this. But this is the kind of situation that often a quick fishbone diagram helps us show our stakeholders, you know what, we might think that IT is going to solve some of the problem, but there's a whole bunch of other elements of the problem that it won't solve. And we can either expand our scope or just focus on elements of it. And what I quite like to do is draw boundaries round. So we might say, you know what, we're going to address the IT, maybe we're going to address the incentives, but we can't address the laws. That part of the problem is still going to exist. It really helps us to scope. You can then extract that and refine it even further. Because what's a really good idea is to have a concise and precise definition of the problem or opportunity that the project will eventually be looking to solve. And a great way of doing that is with the humble old problem statement. Now, there's no absolutely right or wrong way of writing a problem statement, but one possible way is like this. A problem of some sort of problem is affecting some stakeholders somewhere, the impact of which is some negative impact. A successful solution would deliver some positive outcomes. And it takes a lot of iteration to get to a really tight, concise, precise problem statement. But if we do, we get a guiding beacon that people sign up to, and it makes scoping so much easier. And if you think about it, with those 4 lines, we're addressing 4 really important questions. By thinking about the problem of, we're asking the question, what problem are we actually trying to solve here? We can avoid that situation where the project starts to pull itself apart by surfacing any differences in perspective really early. By thinking about who it's affecting, we're asking, who are our stakeholders? Who's got most skin in the game? Who is most vested interest in this situation? By thinking about the impact, we're asking the harsh but important question, why should we care? And I say that flippantly, but quite frankly, in most organizations, there are a number of problems, but the organization only has budget and attention to address a few of them at a time. So this helps with prioritization. By listing the attributes of a successful solution, we then start to ask, what outcome, what benefit are we facing? How do we know when it's done? It's almost like the success criteria for the project. It's the outcome that we're driving for at a high level. So that might sound a bit abstract. So let's take an example. If you imagine a London taxi firm, and if you've ever been or ever seen movies with London taxis in, they look a bit like this. And let's imagine your London taxi firm has done its steeple analysis and it's really worried because it's being disrupted by new channels and new business models. You've got Uber and Taxify and other multi-sided markets and apps coming into play, and they're seeing bookings and passenger numbers dropping. So a marketing director comes into the office and says those fateful words, I have an idea, we need an app. Because we can compete with Uber if we have an app, and we start to sort of have a little, you've got like your analysis antenna starts to twitch and you're saying, well, that feels a bit solution-y. Not sure how that fits to strategy. We need to stay on focus here, on track, on strategy. Maybe we'll just put a little, a problem statement together. And the best problem statements are simple, but they are by no means simplistic. And we start with that espoused problem of we need an app, and we work it through. And maybe we establish after a few discussions, a few iterations, well, the problem isn't a lack of an app. The problem is increased competition from new channels and competitors. The market shifted around us and we need to respond. It affects our drivers and contact center staff because when it's busy, they get really stressed. When there's no work, they get really bored. Would have been really easy to forget our contact center staff, but they are key stakeholders in this. The impact of which is a reduction in bookings. So we have underutilized cars and drivers. We've got assets out there just sitting, not being used. A successful solution would protect us from competitive forces and would allow us to retain and grow our customer base. When you flip this around from we need an app to we need to retain and grow our customer base, it enables a much more divergent conversation about different possible solutions. Rather than just going and specifying an app, we can have a much more open conversation. Maybe it's about appealing more to business customers, account customers. Maybe it's about doing airport runs. Maybe it's differentiating in a different way. But we've dodged that solution illusion bullet. If we just delivered the app without thinking it through, or without encouraging us and our stakeholders to think it through, we might be put in that really tricky situation where we deliver exactly what we've been asked to deliver, only to find out it isn't what was actually needed. So it's very much about staying on that strategic trajectory, acting as the voice, the conscience of the business, really nudging things towards the right trajectory. We can take this even further and talk about the outcomes that we want. If we took our problem or opportunity statement, incidentally, problem statements work for opportunities too. You just tweak it slightly to make it an opportunity statement. So you say the opportunity of would benefit, the impact of which is a successful solution would, and it works just as well. And there's a technique called the Balanced Business Scorecard. I haven't got the opportunity to go through this in detail right now, but there are different categories that you can consider the problem for. So consider financially, what's going to happen when we solve this problem? Are we going to increase revenue, avoid costs? Is it something else? How will we measure it? Because when you've got a scale of measure, it really helps us nail down what the business is aiming for. Equally, from a customer perspective, are we just focusing on avoiding costs? We probably need to balance that against customer experience. There might be some process elements too. On the traditional balanced business scorecard, it was learning and development. It then became innovation. I've bent that to be sustain. And what I mean by that is, what do we need to consider to ensure that problem stays solved or that opportunity stays leveraged? So just coming back briefly to our framework, which is adapted and embellished from BABOK. We've talked about analysing current state with our external factors, with our steeple, our internal factors with our fishbone diagram. There are other techniques, there are so many other techniques I could talk about. There's loads more I'd love to share with you at another time. We've talked about defining or predicting the future state, partly with a problem statement, then building on that with a balanced business scorecard. Of course, then we'd need to analyse the gap, make recommendations, and that could be IT changes, organisational changes, process changes, location change, and any number of things while we're assessing risk along the way, and that will lead to a change strategy, which will probably manifest itself in something like a business case. In doing this, we create a hypothesis of value, and we keep our organisations on track. We help nudge, because ultimately we're not decision makers. If someone decides to go off track, that's fine, but we ensure that people have the data in front of them. They have the telegrams in front of them. They have the maps in front of them to make an informed decision. And we highlight where the icebergs are so that hopefully the organisation and the project can avoid them. One of the questions I'm most often asked at this point is, what if they just won't listen? Like, what if they say, well, I don't care about this pre-project stuff. I just want this new system. We've already decided on the vendor. Just go deliver it. And my answer is always the same. It is so important that sometimes we just have to do it by stealth. Sometimes, you know what? We just, like, even if you just do a couple of problem statements in your own time and bring it to the stakeholders and say, look, actually I noticed that, like, the underwriting team and the marketing team have very different views on what this project is for. Can we just have a mini discussion session about this? You start to show areas where the project is pulling itself apart. And if we do that early enough, there is still time. There is still time to nudge it in the right direction, to pivot. And once we've done that, once we've proved that value, people will come back to us time and time again. They'll engage us earlier and earlier. It's a virtuous cycle, which really shows the value of the strategic analysis, as well as the regular business analysis as well. There's a whole remit of what we do that's so very, very valuable. Final ponder point before I open for Q&A, because I'm keen to allow lots of time for any questions that you do have. This is genuinely the text of the final telegraph that the Titanic received. It had specific information about where the ice was. It had specific latitude and longitude. My question to you is, how many times in your organization has a message like this been ignored? But more importantly, what can we do as an international community of enthusiastic and empowered analysts to help our organizations see those icebergs, to help them innovate, to iterate, so that we can deliver even more benefit, we can co-create even more benefit for our organizations, our stakeholders, and even more importantly, create better outcomes for the communities in which we live and for which we serve. And with that, I will thank you. I will hand back over to Moira for any questions. So Moira, are there any questions?
Hi, Adrian. Yes, there actually are. I've put them all under the Q&A section. I've been typing up. There's been one or two coming through. Can you Can you see them?
Yes, I can see them now. So I shall take them from the top. So the first question I can see is, as a BA, how do you direct or influence strategic business initiatives without becoming the solution architect or the single point of reference for the solution? And thank you to whoever asked that question, because it is an excellent one. And I think the way I'd begin by answering that is, I think it is very much about influencing rather than directing. And it's about nudging. And it's really about ensuring that we are not, that we're asking questions about why the project is necessary, that there's actually a common view on the outcomes that we're trying to achieve. Now, the solution, that's a separate discussion. Because if you think about it, if you've got a problem statement, well, that problem could potentially be solved by lots of different solutions. So the solutioning discussion is separate from that. And that's where definitely a solution architect would you know, or enterprise architects or whatever, business architects, they come into play. And then it becomes, you know, even more of a joint discussion. So it's very much about nudging. But I agree, like as a BA, we're certainly not a single point of reference for the strategy. Okay, so I'm moving on to the next question now. So the next question is, the context of this question is that often when you bring something new to your business where nobody has experience, you're seen as the single point of reference, and you end up putting together. I see, that was so the second question is an addendum to the question I've just answered. I think I've covered that, but if the person asking that question, if I haven't answered it fully, then please do type another question in, and I'll answer it too. Okay,
Adrian, I have a question. I'd like to, can I ask it out loud instead of typing it?
Yeah, please do. Go ahead.
So I mean, a question that I get quite often is from BAs and possibly myself at points is, it's all great, good and well to hear about the strategic thinking, but as a BA, often you're expected to do requirements. How do you go from doing requirements to being involved on a more strategic level?
Yeah, again, great question. I think a lot of teams are focused on that, and I've heard this term emerge, which is left shift, and it's like it's almost gaining the ability to get involved early, and I think the only way I've found of doing that is by showing the value, and sometimes it's by like literally sometimes I've done that by being involved at the requirements stage where I've had no remit, I've had no official remit to do any strategic analysis. But you get that sense that, well, that team over there, they've just got a really different view on what this project is to that team over there. And just by highlighting that and just saying, look, can we just pause just for a day? Just give me half a day. I just want to check this out. And then actually highlighting that and working really closely with the project manager if there is one as well. Because ultimately, if we can show there's a risk here, these folks think it's heading to the left, these folks think it's heading to the right, then we start to really show that there's a risk this thing's going to go off the rails. If we can show that risk, and if that risk exists, then we can much more likely to get the opportunity next time to get involved earlier. And when we get involved earlier, we can shape or help shape the scoping as well.
Thanks, that answers my question.
Brilliant. Okay, so our next question is, where would you see the difference between project management and business analysis when it comes to strategy analysis? Again, another excellent question. So thank you to whoever has asked that. And I take a bit of a controversial view here. So this might not everyone agrees with what I'm about to say. But what I would say is that I think in an ideal world, really, you ought to have a BA involved long before you've got a project manager. And the reason I say that is like, to have a project manager, you've got to have a hypothesis that there is a project there. Whereas actually, there needs to be some analysis done up front to understand, well, what's the opportunity here? What's the problem? What's the environment that we're working in? Now, I know that's not often the case. There are a few organizations that work that way. But I think even if we're involved early, having that really good, clear relationship with the project manager. I know there's often, we joke about friendly rivalry between BAs and PMs. I think that's great. But, if you've got a good supportive PM and a really good supportive BA, then the project will really fly. So I think really most PMs appreciate a good BA that's able to do this stuff. Because if you think about it, if you've got a good problem statement, if you've got critical success factors, KPIs, outcomes, that it's really easy for them to write a project charter or a project initiation document. So we can actually make their lives a lot easier, and they can make our lives easier too. So it's a real win-win. But what is really important if there is a PM and BA is to have that conversation with them and ensure that we're all on the same page about why we're there. Okay, so moving on, our next question is with the problem statement. What if there's more than one problem, or the problem is very complex or very, very complex? Again, another excellent question there. So there are a number of approaches there. You sometimes find that there are multiple problem statements. In fact, you can end up with nested problem statements, sub problems. Also, there's another technique that I haven't got the time to show you this evening called a multiple cause diagram. That is excellent. It's a very, very good technique if you're in a messy situation where there are lots of conflict, where there's lots of different perspectives on the problem. So you do find that even with a fishbone diagram, you tend to extract part of that fishbone diagram into the problem statement. If it's more complicated than that, you'll find that a multiple cause diagram will be perhaps more useful, and you can extract multiple problems from that. Okay, and another question which has just come in.
I just wanted to say, Adrian, and to everyone participating, if you'd like to obviously just unmute and ask questions, that's great as well. Thank you.
Yes, please do, and feel free to interrupt me at any point, because I know when I get excited about these topics, I talk very fast. So another question that's just come in is, how can BAs input into strategic decision making? I think we've probably covered that one all slightly. So how can BAs input into strategic decision making work more broadly if their role is seen as primarily the requirements gatherer? So again, that's similar to the earlier question, really, but I think it's very much about showing our value. And it comes back to that. Sometimes we might be brought in to gather requirements, but even the term gather requirements, right? I mean, the requirements aren't out there. It's not like we come along with our requirements basket and we elicit them, and that's a tough job. We've got people's tacit knowledge, different perspectives on what it is that we're doing. So I think it's very much about if we just build in the strategic business analysis to what we do. And when we start to see strategic conflict happening, just raise the flag, because we're lucky we're in that really unique position as analysts that we can sometimes see things that other people can't, just because of the work we're involved with. And that's so valuable. And I think sometimes it's easy to overlook that value. But, sometimes just raising that red flag and saying, your decision, Mrs. or Mr. Sponsor, but actually, this project is going in two directions. So the scope is creeping, as long as you're all right with that, but, just so you know. So we can start to really have those conversations to help inform decision making. Okay, moving on to the next question. Building on question 1, how does one avoid becoming too involved in the business whilst trying to be strategic and help the business help themselves, i.e. how do you stay a BA versus becoming leadership? Sometimes it's very tempting to step into the business. Oh, fantastic question. Thank you for that one. Yes, and a term I heard some time ago was this phrase of going native, right? Like subject matter expertise is great, but there's that danger that you end up doing an operational role, and that's fine, but the danger is you cease to become a BA. It's hard to be an SME and a BA full time on anything remotely complex. So I think in terms of avoiding becoming too involved, you know, and I know this is a typical BA get out, but you know, it depends. I think it's about being close enough to the business to be able to help with informed decision making, but what we shouldn't be in a position where we're making the decision for them. That's normally the warning sign. Like, you know, when like the business asks you to make a decision for them, I mean, it depends on the context, but that can be a sign that there's perhaps we're a bit too close, or there's you know, an ownership issue going on there. Okay, so I think I am at the end of my questions that have come in through typing. I'm just going to check the chat window as well.
Adrian, I got one other question from a delegate saying, where would the business case fit into strategic analysis? Does it come first or after?
Great question. So, I mean, a typical BA answer, yes to both. So, I mean, typically, the thing is, you need some strategic analysis before you can have any kind of business case. And again, different organizations and different regions call these things different things. But for example, there'll be some upfront pre-project problem analysis, which is you know, the very first part of strategic analysis, really, and that will typically, you know, that will give you enough to do an outline business case, or an outline business case can follow. But then typically after that, there'll be some more, you know, requirements work done, or you know, that there'll be more flesh put on the scope, and more detailed estimates will be produced, or whatever. And then a more detailed business case will be produced. So some strategy analysis or strategic business analysis has to happen before the first business case. What's really interesting is if you as a BA aren't involved with doing that, the question is who's doing it? And it might be someone who's got business analysis skills, which is awesome, and that's great. And if it's someone that hasn't, then the danger is the solution gets fixed on too early, and that can lead to you know, real problems further down the line. Okay, I see a couple of questions in the chat that I'm going to address quickly as well. But again, do feel free to interrupt me and speak live if you'd like. I am a software developer wanting to move into a BA position. What is the best way to go about equipping myself to be considered for this position? That is a huge question for which we could do a webinar all on its own. So I mean, what I would say is just get close to what BAs are doing. If you are, as I'm sure you are, a good developer, you are almost certainly doing elements of systems and business analysis already, even if you've never called it that. So I would take a look at, you know, books and resources that are out there, like IIBA's BA Book, a whole bunch of books out there as well. Look at the techniques, start to integrate them in your work as a developer. If there are BAs in your world, get closer to them, and start to plan a trajectory. It's like with anything, even if you can do a bit of business analysis in your current role, to build the skill. Another question that's been asked is, do you need to have a BA qualification to become a BA? I think that the answer is that depends a lot. I think certification always helps, but experience is really important as well. What certification can do if you're brand new to role is ensure that you know the breadth of the techniques that are out there, that you have a common language that you can talk about in job interviews. But you know, there are BAs out there that aren't certified, and you know, and they do you know, they do a good job. But certification is becoming, I mean, certainly in the UK, I don't know the market elsewhere, but in the UK, certification is becoming more and more requested. If you're new, the IIBA's ECBA, the Entry Certificate in Business Analysis, might be one that you want to look at. There are other certification frameworks out there as well, but ECBA from IIBA, I know Faculty Training Institute have a whole range of really great courses for for new and experienced BAs alike. So check out the website there.
Adrian, I'd also like to attempt to answer that question.
Please.
You're too humble to answer yourself, but there's a great book on Amazon called Business Analyst Careers, written by Adrian Reed.
There is, yeah. I can never bring myself. It's the Britishness of me. I can never bring myself to talk about my own work, but there is. It was released on the 30th.
The link is in the chat.
Yeah. It was released on the 30th of August, so it's freshly available. There is a distributor in South Africa. The Kindle version, the electronic version, isn't quite out yet, but will be in a few days. You can buy it on Kindle as well, and that's got stuff in there that might be useful. So
thank you, Adrian.
Sorry, go ahead.
No, I was just saying thank you for that little bit of info on the new book.
You're welcome. You're very welcome. Good. So I think we're almost at 7, so I should probably hand back to Moira. I mean, again, thank you for inviting me to speak. I could, and if anyone on the webinar wants to know more, just tweet me or email me. I could talk about this stuff forever. So Moira, back over to you to close.
Well, thank you so much, Adrian. It was really a great session. I'm sure everyone's really enjoyed it. Obviously, we look forward to seeing you soon. And also for anyone that's interested, Adrian also wrote a really great blog for us. So that's on our website as well. And I think we're going to do a little lucky draw after this with the participants from tonight. And perhaps the prize could be your newly released book.
Oh, how exciting.
So watch social media and we'll do a lucky draw and announce that. So that will happen tomorrow. But otherwise, from our side, as always, Adrian, thank you so much. And yeah, I'm sure everyone's really enjoyed the evening.
Fantastic. Thank you. Have a great evening, everyone.
Yeah. Thank you, Adrian. Thanks, everyone.
Adrian.
Thanks. Bye.
Thank
Bye.
you.
Moira, are you still online?
Yes, I am.
Okay, it's Mukti. I posted.
Hi. Yes.
Yeah, I posted a question. I just don't know how I could get it to him.
Oh, shame. You know what? If you wouldn't mind, you have my email address, correct?
Yeah, I do.
Won't you just send me the question? What I'll do is I'll just get in touch with Adrian tomorrow. And in fact, if anybody has got an unanswered question, if you'll just drop me an email and I'll send it through to Adrian, I'm sure he'll be happy to answer any questions.
Sure. Okay, then.
Okay.
So, do you have access
Moira?
to Twitter?
Oh, me?
Hello, Moira.
Yes, sorry. Do you have access to Twitter?
Yes, Adrian is very, very active on Twitter.
Okay.
Maybe I should get an account. Okay.
So it's
Okay.
always a very good way to ask him questions.
Yep.
Okay.
Okay, cool. Thanks.
Thank you, Moira.
Thank you. And thank you, everybody.
Okay, then.
Cheers.
Bye.
Bye.
Cheers.
Thank you. Bye.
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 Bye.